welcome back. We're doing something completely new today. Recently, another small YouTuber reached out to me on Goodreads, which is the only place you can reliably find me on the internet, because I delete my social media every other day. And she very kindly said that my videos have been helpful, but kind of hard for her to conceptualize, and she very bravely sent me a poem and said, why don't you make a video editing, providing feedback on a beginner who's not, a famous celebrity or anything like that. And I thought that was an amazing idea, and thank you for doing my job of coming up with video ideas for me. I had a really fun time making this video as well, so if you're interested in having me make a video about one of your poems, you can do that. I cannot guarantee that I will actually get to it, but I'm going to put information in the description box below for those of you who might be interested. Now let's get into it. I'm going to read Harshi's poem. It's called Birds and Bees. They don't tell you these things. They don't tell you it's not butterflies. It's feral and raw and erratic. It's like a swarm of bees trapped in your ribcage. And it feels wonderful, like warm honey spilling between the gaps and making way into the crevices of my heart. And when it ends, which it must, it hurts. The butterflies or the bees or the hummingbirds that thrummed and hummed and banged against my bones are dead. I carry the weight of their bodies and it hurts. The warm honey has made its way up my throat, and the nostalgic sweetness leaves a bitter aftertaste. I miss you, and I miss the beating and buzzing that made me feel like an atom, condensed and complete and full of energy, full of potential, but we are never exempt from entropy, and here's the truth. You left and I feel like an atom, fighting to fill up all this empty space. So first of all, I just want to say this is a lovely poem. I think there's a lot going on here that's working really well, that's really beautiful. I love swarm of bees trapped in your rib cage. I love the images of honey in the heart. I love banged against my bones, and I absolutely love the final lines. You left and I feel like an atom, fighting to fill up all this empty space. I think that's wonderful, and of course it's really important to end on a powerful line. I think this ends on a powerful line. I was also really impressed because to me, atoms are not really in the same category as nature in my mind for whatever reason, even though obviously atoms are everywhere, so they're part of everything, and that includes nature. And so that hit that sweet spot for me that I'm always looking for in a poem, where something comes up that is surprising, that I would not have thought of, but at the same time it's logical and makes sense. So those are the things that stand out to me as really amazing about this poem. Let's talk about some of the areas where I think it could be improved. So I have what might be a personal, subjective, stylistic preference against the repetition of two or more adjectives in a row, two or more verbs in a row, and I'm seeing that a lot in this poem. So I talked about this before in my reacting to my cringy old poetry video, because this is something I used to do all the time. I understand the temptation. So for example, in this poem, there's moments like it's feral and raw and erratic, the butterflies or the bees or the hummingbirds thrummed and hummed, beating and buzzing. And to me, this just tends to read as kind of indecisive, not very self-assured. I just have a personal preference that you pick the best of those adjectives or the most specific, the best of those two or more verbs. And I do understand the temptation. I think that the reason that poets do this, and the reason I used to do this, is because choosing two synonymous or even just similar verbs or adjectives makes it easy to create sound effects like alliteration, consonants, assonance, and rhyme. But the thing is that I just don't find it too impressive because, two adjectives, especially if they are synonyms or even just similar, are probably going to have a similar sound, right? Because adjectives as a part of speech often have similar or the same endings, and verbs often end in ed or ing, etc. So it's kind of easier to create those sound effects by choosing two words of the same part of speech, whereas I would be more interested, more impacted, more impressed if you use that same sound effects with two different parts of speech. Or even if instead of just kind of laundry listing them in a row, maybe you say thrummed in stanza 2 and you say hummed in stanza 4 or something like that, instead of just kind of listing them off in a row. And again, I do think it feels a little indecisive, like the butterflies or the bees or the hummingbirds. Butterflies, bees, hummingbirds, they're similar, but they're not exactly the same. And I think that the best poets and the best poems are precise. If you have a metaphor, you choose butterflies or bees, you know, with the recognition that they're not the same. And you really see that through with specificity. I just think it comes across as more confident, self-assured, intentional. Now, you may say, well, what if the speaker themselves is indecisive? What if they're feeling indecisive? What if that's the tone I want to get across? Sure, you can do that, that's fine. This is not a hard and fast rule. This is something I noticed, this is something I used to do. I think a lot of beginner poets do it. I would just caution against, outside of this specific poem, maybe just don't make a habit of it. It's too easy to become a crutch. Now let's talk about those final lines that I like so much. You left and I feel like an atom, fighting to fill up all this empty space. Beautiful simile, beautiful place to end. I do think it could be made even better though. If I were writing this poem, this is super nitpicky, I would probably keep the tenses consistent. So instead of you left and I feel, I would say either you left and I felt or you leave and I feel. I like the urgency of the present tense there, you leave and I feel like an atom, but it doesn't make as much sense because I think that this happened in the past. So I would probably say you left and I felt. No, this is not a rule, this is a stylistic choice, this is just me. Personally, this is what I would do. I'm also a big believer in concision in poetry, and what that means to me is that you should cut any and all unnecessary words and phrases. Now, when I'm doing this with my own poetry, it's really, really hard. There's that Stephen King phrase, kill your darlings. You know, as a writer, you have to kill your darlings. You might really love what you've written, and it might be a good line, but it might not belong in this poem, or this poem might be stronger without it, and that's really, really hard. Now, the reason I had so much fun making this video is that it's super easy to kill. They're not my darlings. I don't care. I didn't write it. So I was able to make radical changes. I'm going to read you my version of this poem or how I would edit it in a minute. But for example, in these lines, I would cut up all this from the final line. So instead of you left and I feel like an atom fighting to fill up all this empty space, I would have you left and I felt like an atom fighting to fill empty space. I just think it's more concise. I like the rhythm better. It ends on a line with fewer syllables than the preceding line, and I just like it better than ending on a line that has more syllables than the preceding line. I can't really tell you why, I just do in this case. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the fact that this poem uses both you, as in the general, they don't tell you these things, which is really just kind of saying you as in one, as in everyone, and it also uses I. And I think that that's okay, but I want to point out to all beginners that you should be really conscious of when you use you, when you slip into that general sense, which is very tempting. I think there's a distancing, and especially when you're writing about really personal stuff, it feels good to say, this isn't about me, this is about all of us, right? But I would just caution against kind of slipping in and out of I and you. I'm not saying that Harshi is doing this in this poem necessarily. I think that in this poem she moves kind of nicely from you to the more specific I. But in my edit, I kind of broke that up with stanzas. So we had the you stanza moving into the I stanza. And it's those little details, I think, that show that you're aware of when you're using you and when you're using I, and being really conscious of why you're doing that and having a good sort of reason behind it. So now I'm going to read you my version. I'm not saying it's better. I'm just using it to demonstrate the kind of changes that you could make. So the kinds of edits that I made were for line and stanza breaks. I tried to make the lines more even, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, with just a sense of rhythm and kind of flow. I also cut a lot of stuff. I'm sorry, it was easy because they're not my darlings, they're yours. And I did that to really let the best parts hopefully shine. Like I said, I also broke up stanzas between you and I, and I tried to choose just one verb or adjective from the many options in Harshi's version. So this is what was left when I kind of just went wild with edits. They don't tell you these things. They don't tell you it's not butterflies. It's a swarm of bees trapped in your ribcage. Still, it feels wonderful. Warm honey spilling into the crevices of your heart. When it ends, which it must, it hurts. The bees that banged against my bones are dead. I carry the weight of their bodies. Their honey has slit up my throat. I miss the buzzing that made me feel like an atom, complete and full of potential. But we are never exempt from entropy, and here's the truth. You left and I felt like an atom, fighting to fill empty space. So let's talk a little bit about the changes I made and why I made them. You might notice that Harshi's version said, like warm honey spilling between the gaps and making its way into the crevices of my heart, which is a beautiful, lovely phrase, but I tightened it up a little to just say warm honey spilling into the crevices of your heart. I didn't really feel like making way into the crevices was necessary, and so I just cut it mostly for rhythmic purposes. I also changed my heart to your heart because the preceding lines say it's a swarm of bees trapped in your ribcage, so I felt like we were still in the realm of the general. We're describing, I assume, what love feels like. It feels like swarms of things in your ribcage. It feels like honey in your heart. I figured we should just stick with your until we get into the next section, which feels more specific and personal. To me, the logical transition, if there is to be one, from you to I was after, and when it ends, which it must, it hurts. The butterflies or the bees or the hummingbirds that thrummed and hummed and banged against my bones are dead. It's that transition from happy falling in love to something happening, falling out of love, being broken up with, what have you. That felt like the logical transition from you into I, and again I transitioned to that also with a stanza break. Let's talk a little bit more about that, banged against my bones are dead. I loved that phrase, and I just changed it to, again, picked bees, just picked one. The bees that banged against, line break, my bones are dead. What that leaves us with is my bones are dead on its own line, and that's a full, complete sentence, and I think that's a really cool, interesting sentence. My bones are dead. It's kind of like heavy and dark and sad and seems to fit with this poem about heartbreak, grief, etc. So I mostly just made the lines more rhythmically even instead of having some really, really long lines and really, really short lines, but I also did so with an eye towards, some of those enjambment opportunities. Finally, it's worth noting that I cut the line, I miss you, and I thought long and hard about that, and I'm not confident. That seems like exactly the kind of thing that Harshi might say, hey, I liked that line. I mean, you might feel that way about everything that I did, and if so, I'm sorry, and you don't have to keep any of these changes at all. But I can explain a little bit of my thought process there. So, this poem opens with the lines, they don't tell you these things. They don't tell you it's not butterflies. In my mind, in poetry, I kind of think about things in terms of being either challenging, poetic, image-heavy, unique, or kind of easy, straightforward, prose-like. We're starting in a place that's kind of the latter, easy, straightforward, prose-like. That's fine to me. I really like poems that have a balance of both, where there's some challenging, unique, strange, bizarre, poetic lines, and then the poet also just kind of gives us a break sometimes and just kind of tells us what they mean. And in this poem, we have a nice balance of both. I actually think you're doing a great job of that. But let's look at some of those prosy lines, for lack of a better word. And when it ends, which it must, it hurts. And it hurts. I miss you. And here is the truth. I just felt like there was kind of enough of that. And in the case of I miss you, the following lines say, and I miss the beating and the buzzing. So I felt like we were already getting that. It's implied. It's implied that this poem is about heartbreak or loss of some kind. It's implied that there has been a loss and the speaker misses the object of that loss. So I just felt like it was unnecessary. And again, I'm ruthless. My poems tend to be really short. I cut anything that I think is unnecessary. So again, I think that Harshi did a really good job with that balance of poetic lines, prosy lines, harder lines, easier lines, more complex, more straightforward, however you want to create that dichotomy. I think it's almost perfect, but I just thought, you know what, why not cut at least one of these really straightforward lines? Now, I might have chosen the wrong one to cut. This is all so subjective. It feels kind of awkward to edit someone else's poem, but there you go. Those are the reasons behind some of the things that I did. Now again, I am not saying that my version is better. It almost certainly has lost some of the specific Harshi's style, right? I kind of Emily-ified this poem, and I just want to say that this is not at all what I do for either manuscript consulting or patrons. So I do full manuscript consulting, details below in the description box, and I also allow patrons on my $10 tier to send me one poem a month and I give them feedback. Now I do not and would not ever just edit it and hand it back to them. That doesn't even feel like ethically sound to me because that's not what consulting is about. I try to just say basically line by line, here's where I think a decision could be made, and you can either say, nope, you're wrong, or you yourself make that decision, and so your edits maintain your own unique style. I'm not trying to make a bunch of me clones out there in the poetry world. I just sort of did this as a demonstration and because I thought it would be more interesting for a video. Now I want to talk for just a minute about rhythm or meter. I am by no means an expert in metrical poetry. I don't really write with forms, and so my process of creating these line breaks was totally just like an intuitive, go by feel, go by sound process. However, I did notice, I did all those edits just intuitively, and then I noticed something that I want to point out to you about the final 2 lines of the final stanza compared with the final 2 sentences of the second stanza. So they are, I carry the bones of their bodies, their honey has slid up my throat, and you left and I felt like an atom fighting to fill empty space. So I noticed after the fact that there's a real similarity in these rhythms, but it's not exactly the same. And so let's like do a little scanning. Let's go back to high school English and remember how to scan stressed and unstressed syllables. I'm gonna do it on my shoulders, okay? I carry the weight of their bodies. Their honey has slid up my throat. I think that's got a nice rhythm to it. Okay, and then this final 2 lines, you left and I felt like an atom. It's the same rhythm, isn't that cool? I carry the weight of their bodies, you left and I felt like an atom, right? There's like a nice music to that. And then fighting to fill empty space, it's not the same. It kind of drove me crazy because it's almost the same as their honey has slid up my throat, fighting to fill empty space. The only difference is that it starts in a stressed syllable, and I tried to thesaurus that verb so hard, fighting, in order to maybe maintain the exact same rhythm, but I couldn't. And I think that's an important distinction here, right? Because this isn't a formal poem. You don't need to be precise in your meter. And there's an argument that even if this was a formal poem with a precise meter, like maybe, you know, you don't have to follow the rules exactly, especially if following the rules that you've set for yourself are going to result in you using a less accurate verb. So I couldn't find a verb that started on an unstressed syllable that maintained the same sentiment as fighting. And so I wouldn't actually change it. I thought about it, I considered it, I saw the opportunity, but just like with rhyme, rhythm, any kind of sound effect, it's never worth it to thesauricize your verb choices or your word choices if it's going to result in less accuracy, right? I always just am of the philosophy that meaning should come first and it should be supplemented by sounds like rhyme and rhythm and things like that. Because if you go with rhyme first or rhythm first, it just feels really contrived. The reader's aware of your process. So this is a total aside. This has kind of nothing to do with Harshi's original poem because it resulted from my own rhythm. But I just want to talk a little bit about my process and say that, like, maybe it's okay to not be a meter expert, but it is worthwhile sometimes to do a little of that scanning and just see where the opportunities arise for some nice repetition. So that's basically it. Harshi, I just want to thank you so much. I had such a fun time doing this, and I want to really emphasize that I think this poem is good, and I don't necessarily think my version is better. I just wanted to point out all the places where I see options, where I see opportunities for change. Also, everyone, please go check out Harshi's YouTube channel. I'll link it in the description below and also in a card somewhere. It's awesome. I really, really love the video, especially that she made called Pandemics Are Hard, Bread is Soft, I think it was called. That was a really, really beautiful video. And again, if you want me to do this with one of your poems, see the information in the description box below. Okay.